Thanks for joining us for our first Lunch and Learn. Thanks for holding tight. I know we're starting about 3 minutes late. We know you are all busy, but we're so glad you're here. I'm Kalai Chalk, and I do want to let you know that there's some features on Teams that are turned off right now, but you're going to be able to ask questions in the chat, and then we'll get to some of those at the end. Well, as we recognize Native American Heritage Month, I'm thankful for people I've met in the last year who have educated me on the plight of their Native ancestors and forced assimilation by the U.S. government. We'll meet these tribal members in just a few minutes, but first the story that they helped me tell of Fort Spokane, one of hundreds of federal Indian boarding schools where Native children were forced to live and sometimes died.
I don't like the feelings here of this building. I really don't like the feelings here on this whole site, this whole ground. I feel a real spiritual connection to my ancestors when I come here and I know the history of what has transpired here.
Monica Tenasket feels the horror of what happened at Fort Spokane Indian Boarding School. She's seen it on her relatives' faces.
I could think about my great-grandfather and I just think what a sad life he had to have lived.
Her great-grandfather was 11 when he was forced from home to Fort Spokane. Her great-grandma spent years there too.
They were children. They didn't understand. They didn't understand that their parents were forced harm or jail, or they didn't understand that that was the case. They just knew they were sent away.
Children as young as 5, taken from their homes. The philosophy, kill the Indian, save the man. Thousands of Native children from the Colville and Spokane tribes were forced there, stripped of their traditional clothes, given new English names, the boys long braids cut, all of them forbidden to speak their own language, even to each other.
There's generations that didn't get to learn the language because it was torn away.
And the isolation, a far cry from the traditions of their tribe.
Just knowing how this school affected and impacted my family and many families, I just don't feel like this is a great place. It has that eerie feeling.
Today, Fort Spokane is run by the National Park Service.
There are very few National Park Service sites that actually talk about Native American boarding schools, and to the best of our knowledge, this is the only site in the nation that actively preserves and has ownership and interprets an actual boarding school site.
There were once 45 structures on the grounds and thousands of children while the school was in operation, which opened in 1900.
They were only allowed to speak English here. They were punished if they did not. They had a very regimented day where the boys learned how to farm, the girls learned how to be domestic servants. It was really, truly a way to erase their culture.
Standing today, just 4 buildings, including a barn and what is now the museum.
When it became a boarding school, it became the bathhouse for the girls, but the solitary confinement cells were also then used during the boarding school period when students tried to run away to go home.
Yes, I have never been in these cells.
Until today.
When we returned to the school, I was thrown in jail. It was cold and dark.
See, that's sad.
Her 9-year-old daughter once visited on a field trip.
She was very sad, and actually she was crying because she said she saw these cells and how scary they were, and to think that her old papa had to stay in one of these cells when he got in trouble. And she said she never wanted to come back here again.
And what runs through your mind when we walk through here?
Oh, sadness.
Yeah. What do you think when you look at their faces?
They're sad. No smiles. There's no smiles in these children. And to tell you the truth, every picture I've ever seen of my great-grandparents all through their life, I've never found a picture where they're smiling. And really caused a lot of hurt they carried through their lives.
There's no erasing what happened here, but Monica wants you to know that it did.
it's not something we want to share. It's not something we want to relive, because every time you share this type of history, you relive that trauma, you relive those stories. But it's important for people to know.
And joining me today, Monica Tenasket, who you just saw, and Warren Saylor, both with the Spokane Tribe. Thank you so much for being here today. So many of you people in your tribe understand this story. For many other people, this is something that is brand new. Do you think the proper story of what happened to your people is being told and shared to people who aren't Native?
I think that we are just beginning. I think by this story coming out, that I think that was just the start. I haven't seen much media attention to the boarding school era for Native Americans prior to this being aired in our region, but more so after maybe 2 years ago, when the first findings of burials were in Canada. And then following that news release, then it started exposing what was happening in the United States.
Yes, and that has been the case for Spokane as well. As we told another story in addition to this one, was in regards to Spokane children being found at a boarding school in Oregon. What do you guys know specifically about Maddie Lott, a girl who was sent there by her father and then eventually died pretty quickly after arriving there?
So when Chief Lott was unsuccessful on getting a school built on the Spokane Indian Reservation, because he tried for many years. He approached Congress, the Indian Agency, and he desired a school on the reservation to help the tribal kids into the future, to learn and to read and write English. And so when he did not get a school of his own, they approached him and said, let us take your children and we'll take them to where the sun sets, which was Forest Grove, Oregon. And then we'll teach them to read and write and do all these wonderful things, and then we'll send them back to you. So in order to convince the other tribal members, or to help them, to send their children, he sent 2 of his own, Oliver and then Martha, or her nickname was Maddie. And so Maddie was sent to the boarding school, but she was one of those that never returned.
And you talked about Lott with me, and you said his idea of what you just explained wasn't necessarily what other chiefs in the area felt as well. It was kind of divided a little bit on moving forward in this new space.
It was other chiefs, just some chiefs, say on the Colville, Moses and Tenasket, they actually built schools for them on the reservation or nearby. Lott just was unsuccessful in achieving that. And some just weren't ready to take on that era of the incoming white influx. And so those children just remained on the reservation.
And then in the story, many of you have seen the link. It's our second edition to this story with Monica, who talks about Maddie Lott specifically, and how the University of Pacific University reached out and told you that one of your children were buried in Oregon. Since that time, since our story, we've learned that 4 other Spokanes are buried there as well. Where's the tribe right now with figuring out who they were and the family, the living descendants of those people?
So Maddie Lott is buried at Forest Grove. We got additional information that there are 4 additional Spokane tribal members buried at Chemawa Indian School. So Forest Grove had eventually moved to Chemawa. So currently we're still trying to figure out the situation with how Maddie was buried. And we have to work with the Umatilla tribe, because there were several tribal children from numerous tribes that attended Forest Grove. And so Pacific University is doing research on on the burials and where children are buried. So initially, actually going through this process, I've done some more research and read some older files that are the Spokane tribes. And about 19 years ago, our preservation officer had visited Forest Grove because he was aware Maddie Lott was buried there. And at the time, he had noted that Maddie Lott was buried by herself. But since then, there's been new information that there's children, Umatilla children, a child that is buried near her. And we're trying to determine how they were buried. We don't know, time frames or the circumstances around her burial. So the tribes are respectful of each other, and we are working with Umatilla, their cultural resources departments, and with their tribal council as well, so that we're moving forward in a respectful way to determine, first and foremost, we have to determine how the children were buried. And then those will determine our next steps, if we will bring Maddie home or if we will leave her at rest where she is.
And they use ground penetrating radar, so they're able to look and see who and use those records as well to figure out where people are buried and how they're buried. Is there anything to suggest like they were buried in what you hear as mass graves, or in a specific way as to where this boy would be with her?
So there has never been the that research done. There's never been the ground penetrating radar done there. So as of just yesterday, I spoke with their cultural resources officer and discussed that. So the Umatilla tribe is willing to proceed with that so that they can tell where children are buried, because Pacific University has never done that. They have been relying on records, church records, archives. That's the research they have been able to do.
Okay, and Warren, talking about the records and that, it's complicated because lots of times I would assume there weren't records or records that were taken as the way in the way they should have been. But then also you've explained to me that families' names have been changed over the years. So specifically, I know Maddie, tracking her closest living descendant has been difficult because of a name change.
Well, a lot of the tribal people, they would take their tribal name and then they would be given, by the priests and missionaries, they would be given a Christian name or a more something out of the Bible. And so they would change, and sometimes they would use both. Then over the period of time, they would just take up the English name. And so when those names like Lot and Lowley and those types of names come forth, they may have been something previous. And so for Maddie, finding her descendants for the tribe, it's going back through our enrollment, but also going back to the oral history of, most recently there was a young lady, she said, well, Hattie Lott was her grandmother, and she thought Hattie was very closely related to Maddie. And so those types of things we're trying to research and go back through the oral histories of different families to help us, so those families can help in making this decision. Because some records, especially for the Indian children, they did not keep good records. There's a few places where it shows that the children may be buried head to toe, but we're not sure what that truly means. Because there has been places where they were just mass graves, yes.
Do you think the U.S. government has done a good job in recent years, specifically with Secretary Deb Haaland, making the effort to find out what happened at these schools, where they were, and where these children were buried? And specifically, we went to Fort Spokane. Do you think they're doing a good job telling the story of what happened and trying to move forward and making it right?
Well, I think it's starting. I think We've had conversations with the Park Service staff at Fort Spokane, and they're very cooperative with us. So we're going to proceed to work with them. And then on the national front, though, there is, there's a House bill, H.R. 5444. And during this Native American Heritage Month, we're asking all individuals to call their state representatives to ask for them to support this bill. And it's to bring about truth and reconciliation to this story of the boarding school era within the United States.
And important when they're telling this story that they talk to natives.
Yes.
That's been in the past a lot of the missing link of getting to the truth, is that they're not just going through government archives and other things, but they're actually reaching out to the tribes to get the truth from a tribal perspective. And then also how to deal with these sites that have been discovered or are being identified. Because in my personal opinion, there's many more than just those 5. If you look at the oral tradition of Chief Lott himself, he would tell you he sent somewhere between 23 and 27 children down and only 5 returned. So either some of those others did come home, but there's no evidence of that, or they are still in some unmarked graves down in Oregon.
And I think what's interesting is who's doing the work. So I know Pacific has been very active in figuring out who is there. What's the tribe's role in that? Because I know we talked about Fort Spokane specifically, which hasn't been searched for any graves, but they told us that it's up to the tribe to make the effort. So how does that partnership look?
I think Pacific University and the staff is working very well with the tribes. They're reaching out, they're sharing the information they're finding, and like Warren said, there's a lot of, they're looking at archives and history, and then they have to read between the lines because there's information that's not accurate. We've seen documentation that doesn't coincide with what Chief Lott had stated, the number of children sent, and even their numbers don't match up. So, it's really a collaborative effort. And my experience with the staff at Pacific University is they are willing to work with the tribes. And so far, I've only been in communication with the staff at Umatilla, but we all want to work together in a respectful way, in a respectful manner, to really do our ancestors justice and I guess see what direction we go from here.
I mean, we showed you the story. It looks like your voice was stripped. Do you feel like, I mean, you said it feels like we're kind of getting to a point where you're getting your voice back. What do you think, Warren?
I think it's a start. I think in reality, the nation starts understanding that there is much more to the history of the United States and to this region that you can find in the history books, or listening to that history from another perspective. And in instances like this, tribes are just now able to start telling our version of the same story. And so as things like these children and the boarding schools and everything that was taken away, not just children, but all these other things that were taken away from the tribes because of what occurred at boarding schools, those messages are being heard, or at least there's more people willing to listen to those. And that's a good first step, because the tearing down the denials or the shrouds that covered up true history for this continent or for this country, that's a good first start. And I've got to tell you, Kalai, from what Q6 and yourself have done, it probably wouldn't be known around the region to the extent it is. And so that's why today is so important of us sharing what we know with you.
Well, thank you so much for sharing, because that's the first step, is feeling like you have a voice and then being willing to share it with people who maybe have not earned your trust. And we look at that story and we realize why the Native community as a whole may not be trusting. Tell me a little bit about how this that happened years ago is still impacting you and your people and your kids and the reservation today.
Well, so like I shared in the story that we did at Fort Spokane, you know, and when we look at the history of boarding schools, obviously we know it, and we have lived it. Our ancestors lived it. My great grandparents both were in a boarding school. My dad attended a boarding school. My father-in-law attended a boarding school. You know, those are stories that we specifically know, and that history has never been shared before. And so sometimes I think the general public doesn't understand the trauma portion of it. We still deal with that. And I could even tell you, just hearing the stories, like I shared with you, my dad never even shared with me that he was in a boarding school until we did our story. So,
Wow.
you know, I lost sleep over that because I didn't know. And when he shared with me just a little bit about his experience, and he was quiet most of the time, that resonated with me. I felt that day like this is what the historical trauma, what that means, what it actually feels like, because I can only imagine what my dad went through as a child. He was 11 years old and ran away from boarding school, and then was caught later, you know, a ways away, and then was put into a reform school for a year because he ran away from boarding school. So, you know, when you think of the people that you love and you have that close relationship with, and you can just imagine what they had went through, and then being a mother yourself, and now you're looking at your 11-year-old child thinking, how was this ever allowed? How did this ever happen in this country? You know, it's just unbelievable. So I feel like us being able to share that information, I'm hoping that it helps others understand, you know, why we are so passionate about our existence. You know, we want individuals to know we are still here. We still practice our culture and tradition, and despite all the efforts to take it away. And I think that's what I am most proud of, that our ancestors were so resilient, and our people were so resilient that they ensured that we were still able to carry this on despite all the efforts to take it away.
And you think about what your dad lived through, the fact that he had enough shame or enough trauma to where he didn't even share that with you, carrying it his whole life, and then finally doing it. Obviously, he was impacted, therefore you were probably impacted in ways you didn't know. Speaking of resiliency, and speaking of carrying on your traditions, but also a sense of protection for each other, we were talking a little bit about just how the tribes operate, and it is its own entity, so to speak. You guys are on the tribal council, or have been, and specifically a lot of news stations are watching this right now, and we deal with things like crime, for example, on reservations. Frequently, if we're talking about a government agency like the county sheriff's office or the police department, we're able to call them. They have a public information officer. They get right to us. That's not the case when we're working with tribal police. Oftentimes it's quiet. We don't hear from them. Does that go back to lack of trust, Warren?
Lack of trust, for sure, but also history of how we were treated by the police forces that surround us. In the past, there's been a lot of police that have targeted reservation folks. And then also with television stations, they just want that little bleep. That, 5 seconds on a news show in the evening, and then it's gone. Where the tribe takes that, if in some cases, if it's a death or homicide, that's with us for a long period. But what we see is this little blonde girl that may have been killed in a national park somewhere, her story goes on for months. But these Indian women or children or other people that pass away or killed on a reservation, we get 5 seconds. So why would we go out of our way when it feels like you're there just to sell that 5 seconds worth of information? Where if you wanted to know the tribe better, come out like you did. Come out, meet us, get a sense of the reservation people, because it's so much easier to trust you because you've taken that opportunity to learn about us. Mm-hmm. And news stations typically have never done that in the past. And so I think that's probably what even got us here today to share, is because you've gone that extra mile. So many times you only, television stations only come out when there's something bad. Mm-hmm. And that builds mistrust. But if they would come out and report on something that was good, that is exciting to us, that it's a part of us, it's a heritage or something, that's the way you build relationships. Mm-hmm. For tribes.
I think that's a good point. And especially when you consider everything that has happened to natives over the course of generations, then you can understand exactly what you just explained, or have that lens at least. Mm-hmm. I do, though, thank you guys for being able to talk to me and being able to come in here and talk today. I think we're at a start too. You guys have said it a couple of times. I think we're at a start where we are finally understanding how we connect with people. Sometimes you're right. Sometimes it's got to be more than like, Warren, I got 5 minutes, get on camera with me. It's got to be investing in our people and our community, and you guys are doing that for us. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's end on this fun stuff, because it is Native American Heritage Month. What's going on this month for you guys?
Very good.
No, like what I'm saying, what fun stuff is happening for you guys?
Okay, I thought you said this end.
Well, I kind of did, and then I decided I wanted to talk about fun stuff on the last note.
When Monica used the word resilience, and one of the things that the tribes are doing is trying to get salmon back into the waters that our ancestors fished. Many people in the city of Spokane don't realize the magnitude of salmon that used to run from Spokane Falls all the way to the ocean. I mean, we're talking 50, 60, 70-pound salmon, 80-pound salmon, described so much so that they were side to side, head to tail, coming up the river so thick that it seemed like you could walk across their backs. Now, we know we'll never get back to what we ancestors saw, but it's still in our DNA to be a river people, to be fish. And so we've really targeted getting salmon back. And there's, if I had a little bit more time, there's a fish story that would really, truly make you believe it was creator designed.
Wow.
And that was just something that happened within the last 2 or 3 years. And it's things like signs to us like that we know someday salmon will be back in the Spokane River.
I love that. I like ending on that message, Warren. And also, by the way, if you missed it, it was last Thanksgiving. I got an opportunity to do a story with Warren about being a river people and about the Spokane River and about being thankful this time of year. So we'll link that too.
Okay.
All right. Now I'm done. Thank you so much. You guys done? Anything else?
No.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. And thanks for all of you who watched our first Lunch and Learn. It was pretty cool. Let's do it again soon.